is going to be just a quick little video on fuel pumps, lines, and filters. It's just kind of a show and tell is all I want to be doing here, because I was talking about this in the chapter lecture, and this is stuff that I would normally pass around in class. But since we're not in class for the lectures, I thought I'd show it to you on the video. And if you want to see these things in person during lab, you just let me know. But first of all, I was telling you about the incident with my Suburban, where the students had twisted a line. And this is the sending unit that's out of my Suburban. And when they were disconnecting, this is the return line, and this is the pressure line. If you notice, the pressure line is a little bit bigger than the return line, and that's pretty common on most vehicles. But it has a nut right here that you have to disconnect, and then there's an O-ring here, and then there's another fitting with a flare on it, just like this one. So you have to use 2 wrenches to get it undone. They did not use 2 wrenches. They just tried to get it undone with 1 wrench, and if you can see that line right there, how it's twisted, that was causing a restriction in the return line, which was it was causing too much pressure in the rail and causing my problem with the Suburban. So I ended up having to buy an entire sending unit, and this little piece right here was quite expensive. This is what a typical sending unit would look like. This is a metal one. There are plastic ones as well. But the gas pump or the fuel pump sits inside this can right here. This can is designed to hold fuel inside there so that when you go around corners and stuff, it doesn't slosh out and doesn't suck air. The other thing that's on most sending units is your fuel level gauge. And on this one here, it doesn't actually have a fuel pressure regulator. I'll show you a different one that has a fuel pressure regulator on it. And this one is a returnless system. It happens to be out of my wife's Jeep. So if you watch the MotorVac demo, I used my wife's Jeep in that demo. And this is the sending unit out of there. So there's just the one line that goes up to the fuel rail, and that's it. A couple other things that I wanted to show you is I was talking in this chapter about plastic lines and how important it was not to kink them. So this is a hard plastic line. They have a little bit of flex to them, but you can't really bend them too much. If you bend them to this point, what you've got now is you've got a kink in there that doesn't go away. So this kink right here is going to cause a restriction in your fuel line. So you have to be very careful when you're replacing these type of lines that you don't get a kink in them. Also, there's some fuel lines. This one here is kind of a flexible line. It's got a rubber fuel line on it here, but this is actually molded. So it's actually molded onto the fuel filter itself. So on this particular one, if to replace the filter, you would have to replace this entire unit right here. So be aware that those are out there as well. And then this is another style of fuel line right here. This is actually called a Banjo fitting. So it's got this piece over here with a bolt that goes down through here. If you take that bolt out, there's holes that go through the bolt. So the fuel comes in here and it can pass through the bolt, and it seals on this fitting here with little copper washers that are right here and underneath it. But that's called a Banjo fitting. And then I showed you this style of quick disconnect. This is the one that use a quick disconnect tool that you slide in here. This is just like the one that I used in the fuel volume test video. So if you want to see how this one comes apart, check out that video. And I show you how that tool works and how that comes apart. The other thing that I wanted to show you as well is the muffler or the dampener that's in the fuel rail itself, or in the sending unit. A lot of sending units will have one of these little guys in here like this, and what they do is they fit right there, and then the fuel pump goes into it and then goes down, and what this does, this dampens the noise of the fuel pump. And I mentioned in the chapter that sometimes when you buy a replacement pump, this does not come with it. So if you can reuse it, that's great, but they're not 100% necessary. But if you don't put this back in and it had one originally, there is a possibility that you'll have the fuel pump will sound a lot louder than it used to. And that may be a concern to the customer, so you might want to educate your customer if you end up replacing it without one of these. Last thing I wanted to show you is the gas caps. Gas caps are typically made so that they can release pressure and they can also allow air in. And that's why on some of these OBD2 style gas caps, when you turn them on, you're supposed to turn them until they click. And the rule of thumb is 3 clicks. And then they're tight. Because they don't want them too tight, because they've got to be able to expel excess pressure. And then you don't want them too loose because you don't want to suck in air if you don't need air. One of the things that goes bad on these all the time is this rubber O-ring that goes around here. So it is quite common to have these things leak, and they'll throw a, I think it's a P0440 code. It's an evap code it says gross leak detected in the evap system, and a lot of times it's the gas cap. If the gas cap's loose, or it could be this O-ring that's inside the gas cap. So, and then the last thing I wanted to show you really quickly here is a couple of different styles of fuel pressure regulator. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those when we get into fuel injection. But the fuel pressure regulator, usually vacuum operated, there's a diaphragm. When you have more vacuum, it's going to shut down the fuel, because usually if you have a lot of vacuum, that means that you don't need a lot of fuel because your engine's not working very hard. And so there. This is another example of a fuel pressure regulator. It's got a vacuum line going to it. So when you have a lot of vacuum, it's going to minimize the amount of fuel pressure. When you have no vacuum, it'll maximize the amount of fuel pressure. So if you've done your vacuum testing, you'll know that when you accelerate really hard, your engine, your vacuum drops all the way off. And so when the vacuum drops all the way off, the PCM knows that the engine's under load and it needs a lot of fuel. So it's going to dump a lot of fuel in there. So that's what the fuel pressure regulator does. One last thing on these fuel tank sending units is this is another style. It's got a plastic cup instead of the metal one that I showed you out of the Jeep. And this one does the same thing. It traps a little bit of fuel. I don't know whether you can see that down inside there or not. Fuel pumps down in here, and it traps a little bit of fuel in there so that you've constantly got fuel next to the pump. And this little guy down here on the bottom, this is the fuel pressure, or the fuel filter sock that filters out very, very small particles. And the other thing I wanted to show you on this one is on top, this black thing right here, this is the pressure, the tank pressure sensor, and it just goes in. It's there's the other end of it right there. If I get it up into the frame. Yeah, there we go. So there's the other end of it right there. So it just pokes in there, and it reads the fuel pressure, and then that'll allow the evap system to either purge or vent or whatever it needs to do. The other thing is these are a lot of times spring-loaded. And the reason they're spring-loaded is when you put them in the fuel tank and put the lock ring on them that holds them in place, they're compressed a little bit so that when the fuel tank, if it shrinks, it can shrink up. If it expands out, and it keeps the fuel pump on the bottom of the tank. And that's the reason that a lot of these things are spring-loaded.